August 15th, 1973. Steve McQueen walked onto the Paramount lot at 6:47 a.m. for what would be his final day of filming. He carried a manila envelope containing photographs that would destroy 3 careers and expose a murder disguised as a stunt gone wrong. McQueen had refused to work with Clint Eastwood for 6 months. Everyone assumed it was ego. 2 alpha males. Too much testosterone for one set. But that morning, McQueen knew the real reason Eastwood wanted him gone. At 2:15 p.m. during the motorcycle chase scene, Danny Castellano would die. McQueen had the proof in his hands-rigged brake lines, tampered equipment, insurance policies worth millions. He had 47 minutes to stop it. What happened next became Hollywood's most buried secret. 3 studio heads resigned within a week. A film that cost $12 million was never released. And for 50 years, when people asked why McQueen and Eastwood never worked together again, the answer was always the same lie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as McQueen walked past the craft services table, ignoring the coffee and donuts that had become routine over 6 months of filming. The photographs inside weren't just evidence, they were Danny Castellano's death warrant, signed and sealed by men in $1,000 suits who saw human lives as line items on a balance sheet. McQueen's boots echoed against the concrete as he made his way toward Stage 7, where the final chase sequence would be filmed. The irony wasn't lost on him that Hollywood's most dangerous stunt would happen not on location in San Francisco's hills, but on a controlled soundstage where every variable could be managed, every outcome predetermined. Except McQueen was about to change the script. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights studying the photographs his private investigator had delivered. Close-ups of brake lines that had been scored with a razor blade, then carefully concealed. Insurance documents showing Danny Castellano's policy had been quietly increased to $5 million just 2 weeks prior. Most damning of all, a handwritten note from studio head Marcus Brennan to stunt coordinator Frank Morrison, detailing exactly how the accident should unfold. The kid didn't know he was walking into an execution. McQueen rounded the corner and spotted Eastwood near the catering truck, that familiar squint surveying the controlled chaos of a film set preparing for its money shot. Clint wore his costume, a brown leather jacket that would photograph beautifully as he pursued the motorcycle that was meant to crash and burn with Danny still on it. Their eyes met across 30 yards of Hollywood real estate. Eastwood's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of microtell that separated great actors from movie stars. He knew that McQueen knew. "Steve!" Danny Castellano's voice cut through the morning bustle. The 23-year-old bounded over with the kind of enthusiasm that made seasoned professionals either smile or wince. "You see the bike they've got me riding today? It's a thing of beauty. Frank says it'll do the scene in 1 take." McQueen studied the young man who carried his DNA but would never know it. Danny had the same restless energy, the same hunger to push every scene to its breaking point. It's what made him perfect for the role, and what made him expendable to the studio executives who needed a tragedy to solve their budget crisis. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, kid." McQueen's voice carried the weight of every hard choice he'd made in 20 years of filmmaking. "Let's take a walk." "Can't right now. Makeup wants me in the chair in 10 minutes, then Frank's doing final checks on the bike." Danny's excitement was infectious, even as it twisted like a knife in McQueen's chest. "But after we wrap this scene, I'm buying you the biggest steak dinner in Los Angeles. This film's going to change everything for me, Steve. I can feel it." Frank Morrison appeared as if summoned, clipboard in hand, wearing the focused expression of a man who'd coordinated hundreds of dangerous sequences without losing a single performer. His reputation was built on safety, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. McQueen wondered how much they were paying him to destroy all of that in a single afternoon. "Danny, we need to run through the sequence one more time," Frank said, not quite meeting McQueen's eyes. "The bike's been modified for the crash sequence. I want to make sure you're comfortable with every inch of that course." The word comfortable hung in the air like smoke. McQueen felt the manila envelope burning against his ribs where he tucked it inside his jacket. 3 photographs and 2 documents that could save Danny's life and destroy his own career. Hollywood had a way of making heroes disappear when they threatened the wrong people. "Frank," McQueen said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him the king of cool. "I'd like to inspect the bike myself. Old habit." Morrison's clipboard trembled almost imperceptibly. "That's not really necessary, Steve. The insurance company signed off on everything yesterday." "I'm sure they did." McQueen stepped closer, close enough that only Morrison could hear him. "The question is whether they knew what they were signing." Across the soundstage, Clint Eastwood was walking toward them with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly how the next hour would unfold. 3 assistant directors flanked him, along with Marcus Brennan himself, a rare appearance on set for the studio head, unless something particularly important was happening. McQueen checked his watch, 1:28 p.m., 47 minutes, until Danny Castellano was scheduled to die. In his jacket pocket, the evidence that could stop it all felt as heavy as a loaded gun. But pulling that trigger would mean destroying Frank Morrison, exposing Eastwood's involvement, and going to war with a studio system that had made him rich and famous. Danny was adjusting his helmet, running through mental rehearsals of a sequence that was designed to kill him. The bike sat gleaming under the stage lights, every inch of it a perfectly engineered death trap. McQueen made his choice. Stop. The single word cut through the soundstage din like a blade. McQueen's voice carried the kind of authority that made grips freeze mid-motion and brought conversations to an abrupt halt. Danny looked up from his helmet, confusion creasing his young features. "Steve, what's wrong?" Frank Morrison's clipboard had stopped trembling, replaced now by the rigid stillness of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. McQueen pulled the manila envelope from his jacket with deliberate slowness, making sure Brennan and Eastwood could see it from across the stage. "What's wrong is that bike's going to kill him, and every person standing here knows it." The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere in the rafters, a lighting technician dropped a wrench that clattered against the concrete floor like a gunshot. Danny's face had gone pale beneath his helmet. "That's a serious accusation, McQueen." Marcus Brennan's voice carried across the soundstage as he approached, flanked by studio lawyers who materialized from the shadows like vultures. "You better have proof." "I do." McQueen spread the photographs across a nearby equipment table. Close-ups of scored brake lines, insurance documents, the handwritten note in Brennan's own script, 3 weeks of investigation. Every detail of how you plan to murder this kid for the insurance money. Frank Morrison's clipboard hit the floor. His face had aged a decade in 10 seconds. The weight of what he'd almost done, what he'd been paid to do, settling into the lines around his eyes. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring at the evidence. "Jesus Christ, Danny. You almost what?" Danny's voice cracked as he pulled off his helmet, his hands shaking. "Frank, what the hell is going on?" Eastwood had stopped his approach halfway across the stage, calculating the distance between himself and the exit. The micro-expressions that had served him so well on camera now betrayed him completely. Guilt, fear, and something colder, the realization that his own involvement was about to be exposed. McQueen picked up the handwritten note, held it high enough for the entire crew to see. March 15, 1973. F. The brake lines should fail at exactly 2 minutes into the sequence. Make it look like writer error. The insurance payout will solve our budget problems permanently. MB. The soundstage erupted. Crew members backed away from Morrison as if he carried a disease. Danny stumbled against the motorcycle, his face a mask of betrayal and shock. Someone was already on the phone with studio security, though whether to protect the conspirators or arrest them remained unclear. But McQueen wasn't watching the chaos around him. He was focused on Frank Morrison, studying the man who'd been tasked with murdering a kid for money. Morrison had sunk onto a nearby apple box, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with something that might have been tears or rage or both. Frank McQueen's voice was quieter now, meant only for the stunt coordinator. "Look at me." Morrison raised his eyes, and McQueen saw something he hadn't expected: relief. The crushing weight of carrying someone else's murder for 3 weeks had broken something inside the man, and now that the truth was out, he looked like he could breathe again. "I wasn't going to do it." Morrison said, his voice barely audible over the surrounding chaos. "I mean, I was paid to do it, but when I saw him this morning, saw how excited he was about the scene." He gestured helplessly at Danny, who was being led away by a sympathetic script supervisor. "I couldn't. I was going to tell you before the cameras rolled, but you didn't. I was scared." Morrison's admission hung between them. "These people don't just fire you when you cross them, they destroy you. Make sure you never work again." "I've got a family, Steve. A daughter who's getting married next month." McQueen nodded, understanding flooding through him. Morrison wasn't evil. He was trapped, caught between protecting his family and protecting Danny. The real monsters were already disappearing through the stage exits, leaving behind only their tool to face the consequences. Across the soundstage, Danny Castellano sat on an equipment case, staring at the motorcycle that had nearly become his coffin. The kid's hands were still shaking, but his eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there an hour ago. Hollywood had just taught him a lesson about trust and survival that no acting coach could provide. McQueen walked over, settling beside him on the case. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching as security guards cordoned off the motorcycle like evidence at a crime scene. "Why?" Danny finally asked. "Why would they want to kill me? I'm nobody." McQueen studied the young man's profile, seeing his own jawline in Danny's features. Sometimes being nobody makes you perfect for their purposes. Dead heroes sell more tickets than living ones. And you saved my life. Frank saved your life. I just made sure everyone knew about it." Danny turned to look at him then, and McQueen saw something else in those familiar eyes. Gratitude mixed with a dawning awareness that his education in how Hollywood really worked had just begun. Bakersfield, California, September 15th, 2003. Frank Morrison was elbow-deep in the guts of a 1987 Honda Shadow when the UPS truck rumbled to a stop outside his shop. The delivery driver's footsteps crunched across the gravel lot, followed by the familiar sound of the screen door's rusty hinges announcing a visitor. Frank didn't look up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. 30 years of running Morrison's motorcycle repair had taught him to finish delicate work before dealing with interruptions. "Just leave whatever it is on the counter," he called out, not lifting his eyes from the tiny brass jets that needed cleaning. His hands, though spotted with age and scarred from decades of mechanical work, still moved with the precision that had once made him Hollywood's most trusted stunt coordinator. The driver's footsteps retreated without a word, leaving behind only the settling silence of a Tuesday afternoon in California's Central Valley. Frank worked for another 20 minutes, losing himself in the familiar meditation of fixing broken things, a skill that had served him well since fleeing Los Angeles in 1973, though it had never quite worked on the parts of himself that mattered most. When he finally emerged from the bike's engine bay, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had seen better decades, the package on his counter made his blood freeze. It was a wooden film canister, the kind used for 35mm reels in the era before everything went digital. The shipping label was addressed to Frank "Bullet" Morrison, a nickname nobody had used since his Hollywood days, when coordinators earned colorful monikers based on their most famous work. The return address was listed simply as SM Estate, Santa Paula, CA. Frank stared at the package for a long moment, his rational mind cataloging all the reasons why this delivery was impossible. Steve McQueen had been dead for 23 years. His estate had been settled, his personal effects distributed among family members who had no reason to know Frank Morrison existed. More importantly, all the film reels from that cursed 1973 production had been destroyed by court order, every frame of evidence burned to ash in a Santa Monica incinerator. Yet here it was, sitting on his counter like an accusation. Frank's hands shook as he picked up the canister, feeling the weight of actual film stock inside. A small envelope was taped to the lid, his name written across it in handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore a message that made the shop's fluorescent lights seem to dim. Steve knew the truth about Danny. He spent years investigating what really happened that day and what almost happened. The official story was a lie, and he documented everything. These reels were hidden for 30 years, waiting for the right moment. That moment is now. Someone's been covering this up for decades, and they're still out there. Steve wanted you to see this if anything ever happened to him. Be careful who you trust. A friend. The paper slipped from Frank's fingers, fluttering to the concrete floor like a dying bird. His vision blurred at the edges as memories he'd spent 3 decades suppressing came flooding back. Danny Castellano's young face, bright with excitement before the stunt that was meant to kill him. Steve McQueen's cold fury as he spread those photographs across the equipment table. The sound of Marcus Brennan's handwritten murder instructions being read aloud to a horrified film crew. Frank fumbled for the phone mounted on the shop wall, his fingers struggling to dial the number from McQueen's estate. A secretary's voice informed him that Terrence Stephen McQueen had indeed died of cancer in 1980, that his personal effects had been distributed according to his will, and that there was no record of any film materials being held in trust for a Mr. Morrison. The canister sat on the counter like a ticking bomb. Frank tried to convince himself this was some kind of elaborate hoax, a cruel joke from someone who'd researched his past and decided to torment him. But as he turned the canister in his hands, he spotted something that made his heart stop, a small production sticker, partially worn away but still legible. Chase Sequence, Reel 7, Confidential. He'd put that sticker there himself, 30 years ago, during the final day of shooting before everything went to hell. The film was real. Steve McQueen had somehow preserved evidence from that day, hidden it away like insurance against forces that Frank had spent 15 years in Bakersfield trying to forget. And now someone who knew about Danny, about the conspiracy, about everything, had decided it was time for the truth to surface. Frank looked around his small shop, at the quiet life he'd built fixing other people's broken machines, and realized with crystalline clarity that this moment marked the end of everything. The package hadn't just arrived, it had detonated, shattering the careful equilibrium he'd maintained between guilt and survival, between remembering and forgetting. Whatever was on those reels would change everything, and whoever had sent them was still out there, watching, waiting to see what Frank Morrison would do with 30-year-old evidence of Hollywood's darkest secret. The safe life was over. The reckoning had begun. Frank set the canister down and backed away from the counter as if it might explode. His rational mind screamed that he should throw the damn thing in the dumpster behind the shop, pretend it never arrived, go back to the Honda Shadow and lose himself in carburetor jets and timing chains. 30 years of careful distance from Hollywood, 30 years of building walls between himself and that cursed production, and now this. He lasted exactly 4 hours. The canister drew him back like a magnet every time he tried to focus on other work. By 6 o'clock, when the last customer had picked up their repaired Harley and the shop fell into evening quiet, Frank found himself standing at the counter again, staring at the film reel that contained God knew what kind of evidence. His hands shook as he reached for the phone. The number came to him without conscious effort, muscle memory preserved across 3 decades of trying to forget. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. Castellano residence. Maria? It's Frank Morrison. The silence stretched so long he wondered if she'd hung up. When Maria Castellano finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a mother's unhealed grief. Frank Morrison. Christ almighty. I thought you were dead. Sometimes I wish I was. He stared at the canister, wondering how to explain its arrival without sounding insane. Maria, I need to ask you something about Danny, about what happened that day. What happened is that my boy almost died because of studio greed, and you nearly helped them do it. Her voice turned sharp with old anger. Steve McQueen saved Danny's life. You would have fed him to the wolves. It's more complicated than that. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems pretty simple. They paid you to rig a motorcycle to kill my son for insurance money. The only thing complicated about it is how you've managed to sleep at night for 30 years. Frank closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settle on his chest. Maria, please. Something's happened. I received a package today. Film reels from that production. They were supposed to be destroyed. The silence returned, but this time it carried a different quality. Fear, maybe. Or recognition. What kind of reels? Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. I don't know. I haven't looked at them yet. But whoever sent them claims Steve was still investigating what happened, that he documented things, kept evidence hidden. Frank paused, studying Maria's reaction through the static. You know something about this, don't you? I know enough to tell you to burn those reels and forget you ever saw them. Maria's words came fast now, urgent. Frank, there are people who don't want that story told. People with long memories and longer reach. Steve learned that the hard way. What do you mean? I mean, Steve McQueen didn't die of cancer in 1980. That's what they wanted everyone to believe. But the truth is more complicated. Her breathing had become labored, as if the conversation was physically exhausting her. He kept digging after that day on set, kept asking questions about who else was involved, how high up the conspiracy went, and then one day he just got sick, real sudden-like. Frank felt ice forming in his stomach. You think someone killed him? I think Steve McQueen made some powerful enemies when he saved Danny's life. And I think those same people have been watching everyone connected to that production ever since, making sure the truth stays buried. A pause then. Frank, where are you calling from? My shop in Bakersfield. Jesus. You need to get out of there, right now. If they sent you those reels, it means they know where you are. It means they want something from you. Frank looked around his small repair shop, at the life he'd built in the shadows of his past mistakes. Through the front window, he could see the parking lot bathed in amber streetlight, empty except for his own truck. Nothing moved in the September evening heat, but suddenly the silence felt ominous rather than peaceful. Maria, I need to know what's on these reels. No, you need to run. Pack whatever you can't live without and drive until you hit another state. Don't use credit cards. Don't call anyone you know. Don't. The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone for a moment, then slowly placed it back in its cradle. Outside, a car engine started somewhere in the distance, the sound carrying clearly through the still night air. He moved to the front window and peered through the blinds, but the parking lot remained empty. The canister sat on the counter behind him, 30 years of buried secrets waiting to be unleashed. Frank knew with absolute certainty that once he opened it, there would be no going back to the quiet life he'd built. But Maria's fear had been real, and her warning about people with long reach made his skin crawl. He was already in danger just by possessing the film. The question was whether the truth it contained was worth dying for. Frank reached for the canister, his fingers trembling as they found the metal clasp. Maria's warning echoed in his mind, but 30 years of guilt had hollowed him out, leaving only questions that demanded answers. The lid came off with a soft click that sounded like a coffin opening. Inside, nestled in protective cloth, lay a single reel of 35mm film and a manila envelope sealed with red wax. The production label was indeed in his own handwriting, his younger self's careful block letters from a lifetime ago. But beneath his label, someone had added another in pencil. Danny. Final take. The truth. Frank's hands shook as he broke the wax seal. Inside the envelope were photographs, dozens of them, along with handwritten notes in Steve McQueen's distinctive scrawl. The first photo showed Danny Castellano laughing between takes, his face bright with the kind of joy that only comes from doing what you love. Frank remembered that moment. The kid had just nailed a particularly difficult sequence, and the whole crew had burst into applause. But it was the second photograph that drove the air from Frank's lungs. Danny and Steve McQueen sat side by side on apple boxes during a break, and the resemblance was unmistakable. Not just the jawline Frank had noticed 30 years ago, but the way they held their shoulders, the identical tilt of their heads when they laughed. Father and son, captured in an unguarded moment that explained everything about McQueen's desperate investigation. Frank's vision blurred as he read McQueen's notes, scribbled in the margins like a man documenting his own destruction. Danny doesn't know. Maria promised me she'd never tell him, and I kept that promise even when it nearly killed us both. But I won't let them murder my boy for insurance money. I won't let them profit from his death. Another note, dated weeks after the incident. Brennan was just middle management. The order came from higher up, studio heads who saw Danny as expendable. They planned to make him a martyr, use his death to generate sympathy publicity for the film. a young stuntman dying in service of his art. The insurance payout was just gravy. And then, in different ink, added later, "They're watching me now. Phone calls at strange hours, cars following me home from the studio." Maria was right. Some secrets are too dangerous to chase. But if something happens to me, Frank Morrison needs to know the truth. He was just their tool, but he'll blame himself forever unless he understands how deep this goes. Frank set the photographs aside with hands that felt disconnected from his body. The weight of what he'd almost done, not just participating in murder but killing Steve McQueen's son, settled into his bones like lead poisoning. Every day for 30 years he'd told himself he was just a coward who'd taken dirty money and lost his nerve at the last minute. A weak man, but not a monster. Now he understood the truth was worse. He'd been selected specifically because of his desperation. His daughter's wedding expenses, his wife's medical bills, all of it had been researched, cataloged, used to identify him as the perfect weapon. They'd counted on his guilt keeping him quiet, and they'd been right. The sound of gravel crunching in the parking lot made Frank freeze. Through the blinds he could see headlights approaching slowly, too slowly for a customer or casual traffic. The car, a dark sedan with tinted windows, pulled into the space directly in front of his shop and sat there, engine running. Frank grabbed the photographs and shoved them back into the envelope, his heart hammering against his ribs. The film reel went back into its canister with shaking hands. Whoever was in that car had been watching, waiting for him to discover what the package contained. Now they knew he'd taken the bait. The car door opened, and a figure emerged, tall, wearing a suit despite the evening heat. The man moved with the measured pace of someone comfortable with violence, scanning the parking lot before approaching the shop's front door. Frank killed the lights and crept toward the back exit, clutching the canister against his chest. Through the darkness, he could hear the man testing the front door, then the soft scraping sound of someone working on the lock with professional tools. The back door opened onto the alley where Frank kept his personal motorcycle, a restored 1970 Triumph Bonneville that he'd maintained with religious devotion. His hands fumbled with the keys as footsteps echoed inside the shop, moving toward the counter where he'd been standing moments before. The Triumph roared to life just as light blazed through the shop's front windows. Frank gunned the engine and shot into the alley, the canister secured in his jacket pocket and 30 years of careful anonymity disappearing in his rearview mirror. Behind him, the dark sedan's headlights swept across the alley entrance, but Frank was already gone, carrying Steve McQueen's final investigation into the California night. The truth was out, and there was no going back to the quiet life of fixing other people's broken things. Some secrets, once unearthed, demanded blood. The Triumph's engine screaming as he pushed toward the city limits. The canister pressed against his ribs like a guilty conscience, 30 years of buried truth threatening to burn through his jacket pocket. He kept checking his mirrors, but the sedan's headlights had long since disappeared into the maze of industrial streets behind him. 20 miles outside town, he finally pulled into a truck stop that glowed like a neon oasis against the desert darkness. His hands still trembled as he killed the engine, and found a corner booth in the diner, ordering coffee he didn't want from a waitress who'd seen enough midnight runners to mind her own business. The canister sat on the table between his hands, innocent as a prayer book. Frank knew he should keep running, follow Maria's advice and disappear into whatever remained of his life. But McQueen's handwritten notes had opened something in him that 30 years of guilt couldn't close. If Danny Castellano was Steve's son, then everything Frank thought he knew about that day was wrong. He needed to see the film. The truck stop had a small back office that the manager let drivers use for paperwork. For $20 and a promise to be gone by dawn, Frank gained access to a room with electrical outlets and enough darkness to rig a makeshift viewing setup. His old film knowledge came back like muscle memory as he jury-rigged a projection system using a camping lantern and a white wall. The first frames made his breath catch. There was Danny Castellano in perfect clarity, 19 years old and immortal in celluloid, preparing for the stunt that was meant to be his last. But this wasn't the official footage Frank remembered. This was something else entirely, shot from a hidden angle with a handheld camera. The film showed everything the studio version had omitted. Danny checking his motorcycle one final time, his face serious with professional concentration. Marcus Brennan approaching with last-minute adjustments to the stunt parameters. And then, in a moment that stopped Frank's heart, Steve McQueen himself entering the frame. McQueen moved with predatory focus, examining Danny's bike with the intensity of a man who knew exactly what to look for. His hands traced the brake lines, the throttle cable, the steering mechanism, and then he found it, a small device, barely visible, attached to the rear brake assembly. Frank watched in horrified fascination as McQueen carefully documented the sabotage with his hidden camera, then began methodically disabling it. The device was elegant in its simplicity, a remote-controlled mechanism that would lock the rear brake during the high-speed chase, sending Danny into an unrecoverable skid at precisely the moment when survival was impossible. But that wasn't the revelation that shattered Frank's world. The real bomb came in the film's final minutes, when McQueen's hidden camera captured a conversation between Marcus Brennan and another figure in the shadows. Frank leaned closer to the improvised screen, squinting at the grainy image, and felt his entire understanding of that day collapse. The second figure stepped into clearer light, and Frank's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the concrete floor. It was himself, his own face, 30 years younger but unmistakably his own, listening intently as Brennan explained the true plan. "Morrison's perfect for this," his younger self was saying, voice tinny through the hidden microphone. "Desperate enough to take the money, skilled enough to make the sabotage look accidental, and weak enough to keep quiet afterward. Danny trusts him completely. Never suspect his own stunt coordinator set him up." Frank watched his own betrayal unfold in stark black and white, remembering nothing of this conversation, nothing of this moment. But there he was, nodding along as Brennan outlined the murder plot, even suggesting improvements to make the accident more convincing. "What about McQueen?" Brennan asked on the film. "McQueen doesn't matter," Frank's younger voice replied with chilling certainty. "He's just the star. By the time he figures out what happened, Danny will be dead and buried, and we'll all be rich men." The film ended abruptly, leaving Frank staring at white wall and trying to breathe through the crushing weight of recovered memory. It came back in fragments now, the secret meetings, the planning sessions, his own eager participation in what he'd somehow convinced himself was just an elaborate insurance scam that would scare Danny without really hurting him. But that was the lie he'd told himself for 30 years. The truth, preserved in McQueen's hidden footage, was that Frank Morrison had been a willing conspirator in attempted murder. Not a reluctant tool, but an architect of the plan that would have killed Steve McQueen's son. McQueen hadn't just saved Danny that day. He'd saved Frank from becoming a murderer, and Frank had never even known it. The truck stop diner seemed to spin around him as understanding hit like a physical blow. 30 years of guilt over taking blood money paled beside this revelation. He'd been ready to kill a 19-year-old kid for pocket change and had somehow erased his own complicity from memory. Some truths, once unearthed, didn't just demand blood, they demanded everything. Frank sat motionless in the truck stop's flickering fluorescent light, the weight of his recovered memories crushing down like a collapsed mine shaft. The film projector had gone silent, but the images burned behind his eyelids, his own face 30 years younger, planning murder with the casual efficiency of a man ordering breakfast. He pulled out his phone with hands that belonged to someone else, scrolling to a number he'd memorized but never called. Maria Castellano answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep and old pain. "Maria." His voice came out as a croak. I watched the film. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. When she finally spoke, her words carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying secrets too long. "All of it? Enough." Frank pressed his palm against his forehead, feeling the phantom weight of 30 years of false guilt. "I remember now. Christ, Maria, I remember planning it. How did I forget? How did I convince myself I was just a victim?" "Because the mind protects itself," she said quietly. "Because living with the truth would have killed you. So your brain built you a different story, one where you could sleep at night." Through the diner window, Frank watched a semi pull away from the gas pumps, its running lights disappearing into the desert darkness. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago. But the world had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer Frank Morrison, reluctant accomplice haunted by cowardice. He was Frank Morrison, architect of attempted murder, saved from damnation by Steve McQueen's intervention. "Why did Steve keep the film?" Frank asked. "If he knew what I'd done, why protect me?" Maria's laugh held no humor. "Because he understood something you're still learning. The studio didn't pick you randomly, Frank. They studied you, manipulated you, pushed you to a breaking point where murder seemed reasonable. Steve saw that conspiracy went higher than one desperate stunt coordinator. But I made the choice. I looked at that kid, your son, his son, and decided his life was worth less than my financial problems." "Yes," Maria's honesty cut like a blade. "You did. But Steve also saw you hesitate at the end. Saw you starting to have second thoughts in those final minutes before the stunt. That's why he was ready with the camera, why he was watching so carefully. He knew you were wavering." Frank closed his eyes, trying to pull more memories from the fog of suppression. Fragments came back, standing beside Danny's motorcycle in those final moments, his hand hovering over the sabotage device, feeling something twist in his gut that might have been conscience finally awakening. "The studio executives," Frank said. "The ones who set this up, they're still out there. Some of them. Marcus Brennan died in a car accident 3 years after the incident. Real accident, far as anyone could tell, but convenient timing." Maria's voice hardened. "But the man who gave the orders, who signed off on murdering my boy for insurance money, he's very much alive. And he's been watching everyone connected to that film, making sure the truth stayed buried." "Who?" "Robert Sinclair. Studio head at the time, senator now. He spent 40 years building a political career on the foundation of keeping that conspiracy quiet." Maria paused, and Frank could hear her breathing become labored. "Steve got too close to proving Sinclair's involvement. That's when he started getting sick. Real sudden, real convenient. The name hit Frank like ice water. Robert Sinclair, he'd seen that name in political coverage, campaign contributions, corporate boardrooms. A man who'd successfully transitioned from Hollywood power broker to political influence peddler, his past sanitized by decades of careful image management. "Maria, if Sinclair killed Steve to keep this quiet, what does he want with me? Why send the film now?" "Think about it," she said. "You're the last living witness who participated in the original conspiracy. Everyone else is dead or bought off. But you've been running a motorcycle shop in Bakersfield for 30 years, telling yourself fairy tales about being an innocent victim." Understanding dawned with horrible clarity. "He needs me to remember. He needs me to know what I really did. Because guilt makes people controllable. As long as you believed you were just a coward who took dirty money, you were manageable. But if the truth ever came out, you could claim ignorance, play the victim." Maria's voice turned urgent. "Now you know better. Now you know you were a willing participant in attempted murder. That makes you vulnerable to blackmail, manipulation, whatever Sinclair needs." Frank looked down at the canister, understanding finally why someone had wanted him to have this evidence, not to free him from guilt, but to trap him with the truth. The film wasn't vindication. It was a chain around his neck, proof of crimes that could destroy what remained of his life. But there was something Maria didn't understand, something the film had shown him that changed everything. In those final frames, he'd seen his younger self hesitate, seen the moment when conscience had tried to break through greed and desperation. Steve McQueen had saved them both that day, Danny from death, and Frank from becoming the monster he'd been groomed to be. The question now was whether Frank Morrison had 30 years too late learned to save himself. Outside, headlights swept across the parking lot. The decision that could no longer be avoided was simple: run and stay controlled, or fight and risk everything. Some truths demanded blood, but some demanded something harder: redemption. Frank didn't run. The headlights belonged to the same dark sedan from his shop, and as it pulled into the truck stop's parking lot with predatory patience, he felt something crystallize inside him. 30 years of self-deception burning away like morning fog. He pocketed the canister, left money on the table for his untouched coffee, and walked outside to meet whatever was coming. The sedan's engine died, and Robert Sinclair emerged into the fluorescent glare of the gas pumps. At 73, The man still carried himself with the commanding presence that had built empires and buried secrets. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the late hour, his suit expensive enough to buy Frank's shop twice over. "Mr. Morrison." Sinclair's voice carried the practiced warmth of a career politician. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Steve McQueen's film?" Frank kept his distance, hyper-aware of the weight in his jacket pocket. "Funny thing about that. I just remembered why it was so important." Sinclair's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. Memory is a fragile thing, unreliable. What we think we remember from 30 years ago, especially traumatic events, often bears little resemblance to reality. The film doesn't lie. Frank felt the desert wind cut through his jacket, carrying the scent of sage and old sins. "Shows everything. My face, your voice giving Brennan his orders through that radio, the whole conspiracy laid out in black and white." "Does it?" Sinclair stepped closer, and Frank caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, the metallic tang of fear carefully controlled but present. Or does it show a desperate stunt coordinator planning an insurance fraud that got out of hand? A man so consumed by financial pressure that he convinced himself attempted murder was justified. The words hit their target. Frank had spent the past hour wrestling with exactly that interpretation, wondering how much of his recovered memory could be trusted. But something about Sinclair's certainty, his practiced deflection, confirmed what the film had shown. "Steve McQueen figured it out," Frank said quietly. "That's why he got sick so fast after the incident. Nothing natural about that cancer, was there?" For the first time, Sinclair's composure cracked. The politician's mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Steve McQueen was a reckless man who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. He paid the price for his curiosity. He saved his son's life, and mine. He saved Danny Castellano from an accident that would have made him a legend. Instead, the boy lived to become a footnote, another mediocre stuntman who never amounted to anything. Sinclair's voice turned conversational, almost friendly. "Do you know what Danny's life was worth, Mr. Morrison? Really worth? The insurance payout would have been $12 million. The publicity from a tragic on-set death would have generated another $50 million in box office revenue. Instead, we got a mediocre action film that barely broke even." Frank stared at this man who could calculate human life in quarterly earnings, feeling something shift inside him like tectonic plates finding new alignment. The guilt he'd carried for 30 years, guilt over cowardice, over taking blood money, over failing to act, transformed into something cleaner and infinitely more dangerous. "You made a mistake," Frank said. "Which was?" "You let me live with partial truth for 30 years, gave me time to build something decent out of the wreckage, made me care about redemption." He pulled the canister from his jacket, holding it between them like a weapon. "A man with nothing to lose is controllable. A man who's found something worth protecting isn't." Sinclair's hand moved inside his suit jacket, not for a weapon, Frank realized, but for a phone. One call would bring people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently, men who wouldn't hesitate to kill a 68-year-old mechanic in a truck stop parking lot. But Frank was already moving, muscle memory from his stunt days taking over. He grabbed Sinclair's wrist with his free hand, applying pressure to the nerve cluster that dropped the phone to the asphalt. With his other hand, he pressed the film canister against Sinclair's chest like a gun barrel. Steve McQueen spent his last months making copies of this film. Frank lied with absolute conviction. Sent them to people he trusted, lawyers, journalists, federal investigators, all with instructions to release everything if anything happened to the witnesses. It was a bluff built on hope and desperation, but Sinclair's face went white as courthouse marble. A man who'd spent 40 years burying one secret would believe in the possibility of others. "What do you want?" Sinclair's voice had lost its political polish, revealing the fear beneath. Frank released the man's wrist and stepped back, the canister still clutched in his fist. 30 years too late, he finally understood what Steve McQueen had known. Some truths were worth dying for, but more importantly, they were worth living for. "Justice," Frank said simply. "For Danny, for Steve, for everyone you destroyed to build your empire." The reckoning had begun. The confession took 3 hours. They drove to the nearest FBI field office in Fresno, Sinclair white-knuckled and silent behind the wheel of his sedan, while Frank sat in the passenger seat with the film canister balanced on his knees like a talisman. The federal building loomed against the pre-dawn sky, its windows dark except for the duty officer's lonely vigil on the 3rd floor. By sunrise, it was over. 40 years of buried truth spilled out in sterile conference rooms under fluorescent lights, recorded by digital devices that would preserve every word for posterity. Sinclair's empire, built on Danny Castellano's near death and Steve McQueen's murder, crumbled with the methodical efficiency of a controlled demolition. Frank gave his statement last, his voice steady as he detailed his own complicity in the original conspiracy. The young FBI agent taking notes looked up in surprise when Frank refused the immunity deal they offered, insisting that justice meant accountability for everyone involved, including himself. Accessory to attempted murder carries a potential 20-year sentence, the agent warned. At your age, I've been serving that sentence for 30 years, Frank replied. Time to make it official. The trial lasted 6 months. Frank spent most of it in federal custody. His motorcycle shop closed and boarded up, his few possessions distributed among the other inmates who'd befriended the polite old man who never complained about the food or the noise. Maria Castellano visited twice, her health failing but her eyes bright with something that might have been peace. Danny's proud of you, she said during their final meeting, her hand paper-thin against the visiting room table. Wherever he is, he knows you finally did right by him. She died 3 weeks later, taking with her the last direct connection to that cursed film set. Frank learned of her passing from a brief newspaper obituary that made no mention of her son or the secrets she'd carried. The sentencing hearing fell on a Tuesday in November, 31 years to the day after Steve McQueen's death. Frank stood before Judge Catherine Pierce in the same suit he'd worn to his wedding 4 decades earlier, listening as she detailed his crimes with clinical precision. Conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, racketeering. The charges rolled over him like a tide he no longer had any interest in fighting. However, Judge Pierce continued, her voice softening fractionally, the court recognizes that your cooperation was instrumental in bringing to justice a conspiracy that claimed multiple lives and corrupted our justice system for decades. Furthermore, your voluntary surrender and insistence on accountability demonstrate genuine remorse. She sentenced him to 4 years with possibility of parole in 18 months. It was more merciful than he'd expected, less than he'd deserved. As the bailiff led him away, Frank caught sight of a familiar figure in the gallery's back row, a young woman with Danny Castellano's dark eyes and Maria's determined chin. His granddaughter, he realized, come to witness the end of her family's long wait for justice. Frank served 22 months at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lompoc, working in the motor pool and teaching motorcycle maintenance to younger inmates who called him Pops and listened with surprising attention to his stories about the old Hollywood stunt crews. He kept his head down, served his time with quiet dignity, and counted himself lucky to wake up each morning without the crushing weight of suppressed truth on his chest. The day of his release dawned clear and cold. Frank emerged from the prison gates carrying his few possessions in a paper bag, blinking in sunlight that seemed brighter than he remembered. A figure waited beside an old Triumph motorcycle, helmet tucked under his arm, a young man with familiar features and an easy smile. Mr. Morrison, I'm Paul Castellano. Maria was my grandmother. They shook hands while Frank struggled to find words. The young man, Danny's nephew, he realized, gestured toward the motorcycle with obvious pride. Thought you might want to ride somewhere. This was Danny's bike, actually. Been restoring it for years. Paul's grin widened. Grandma always said Danny would have wanted it to carry a righteous man. Frank climbed onto the Triumph's worn seat, feeling the familiar weight of a motorcycle beneath him for the first time in 2 years. As Paul kick-started the engine and they pulled away from the prison, Frank closed his eyes and listened to the engine's honest rumble, a sound free of guilt or deception. They rode east through the desert, past Joshua trees and abandoned gas stations, while the sun climbed toward noon. Frank didn't ask where they were going. For the first time in 30 years, the destination mattered less than the journey itself. Two men connected by tragedy and redeemed by truth, carrying the memory of those who hadn't lived to see justice done. Behind them, the prison disappeared into heat shimmer, taking with it the last physical remnant of Frank Morrison's long penance. Ahead lay whatever remained of his life, smaller now but infinitely more honest. Some stories, Frank realized, stayed with you not because they ended happily, but because they ended true.